Hi, this is just a bit of an addendum to the last video where we were talking about Eckhart Tolle and in particular one quotation which I'll read again. Eckhart Tolle says in his book A New Earth, "Fear, anxiety, expectation, regret, guilt, anger are the dysfunctions of the time-bound state of consciousness." And I tried to make the argument that they're not dysfunctions, they're actually perfectly natural parts of life, and they're actually necessary to survival and success in life. Some interesting comments came through for and against this position, and it has helped me clarify to myself why I think Eckhart Tolle is wrong. So let's examine this. Just scroll down here. Someone says, "Do you honestly think Eckhart Tolle is that dim-witted to not acknowledge the functionality of fear? That's not what he's talking about if you've read the books and are familiar with his teachings. He's talking about fear arising from identification with the false sense of self." I got into quite an extended conversation with this person about that. Actually, I don't know everything Eckhart Tolle has said, but there's no concentration that I have seen on from anything I've read or heard from him where he talks about legitimate fears. If anything, he seems to present this picture that one can be liberated from suffering entirely. And that is done through identifying that the ego is a fiction, and then that frees you from all attachment to anything egoic about consciousness. That's not true. That's an exaggeration. It is true that the ego is a fiction. You do not exist in the sense of an entity. I've come to that realization long ago, and it's an important realization. But Eckhart Tolle, like a lot of spiritual teachers, errs on the side of exaggeration, and in so doing he poisons any legitimate insight that you might get from that kind of understanding of consciousness. Someone else said something that this is where it really started to get clarified to me. This person says, "My understanding and experience of Tolle's teachings is a bit different from what you are presenting, Darrell. I propose that there are two types of fear. One is what you opened with about the lion and the gazelle, which is a biological reaction, a survival mechanism. The other is more of a psychological state, which is seen easily in relationships. If I want something from you and you hold all the cards, I am fearful that I may not get what I want. There are so many examples of this. I want you to accept me, love me, give me a job, stop belittling me, not leave me, lend me money, take care of me in some way, keep me company, and on and on. This causes all sorts of problems and dysfunctions whenever we want something from someone that we can't do for ourselves or we think we can't do for ourselves. The fear that the bank robber experiences speaks more to her knowledge of possible consequences for her actions than that of biological fear. Being present or living in the now are experiences that are very common when we forget about ourselves for just a moment, like when you laugh at a joke or smile at a baby." I'll stop there. I'll just read the final paragraph because this is quite a long comment. Very good comment, actually, very well thought out. "I've read and listened to many of the non-dual teachers, and I don't think that Tolle is saying that life is never difficult or that you'll never again suffer." Well, he has said that, to be fair. "His message has been helpful to smooth out some of the rough edges in my way of thinking and to not take my thinking or anyone else's thinking as definitive truth. Also, the most important thing I've learned from them is to be radically honest with myself, painfully honest." Okay. Getting back to the very beginning of that comment, two types of fear, that right there, I think, hits the nail on the head, because I examined that and I joined my understanding of this together and realized that there aren't two types of fear. There is the fear of fear experienced by the gazelle as it's chased by the lion. Or let's use a human example. You're walking down an alley, and you hear footsteps getting louder behind you, and you turn around, and there's someone with a knife starting to run towards you, and you get the feeling that they're going to assault you. So there's fear. There's understandable primal fear filling your veins with adrenaline, and you gotta run, right? And you won't even have to think about running. You're just gonna run, right? I don't know that Tolle has ever really talked about that sort of fear. He seems to me that he just lumps fear into one category and says you can transcend it, along with other emotions like anger and regret and so on, and guilt. I mean, even I, as a non-Christian, with no God reference point, can understand the value of guilt. And I also understand why I feel it, even though there's no God. Because, I still possess something that you might call my humanity. And I still possess the capacity to go against that. And I'll feel guilt as a result of it. And it happens. It happens too regularly, to be honest. Because I'm a bit stupid that way sometimes. But anyway, getting back on point here, we're talking about fear. So what's the difference between the fear of that person in the dark alley and the fear of someone who's maybe worried about losing their job? There's no difference, except all fear is based upon what we commonly call time, right? And time is the projection of, it's the ability to imagine the changing shape of the present moment, right? So let's really use that esoteric view of time. It's always the present moment. The present moment's always changing. We will always encounter the future as the present. So when you're running down the dark alley, your present moment experience isn't that you've been attacked. Your present moment experience is that you can see that an attack is very likely imminent, that you are about to be harmed in the immediate future, right? So the time between the events is very short, so the fear is very intense and very certain, right? So you feel fear. But with these fears that are further off, they're just further off in time. You maybe look at your firm and there's been cutbacks in the past, budget cuts, and you're maybe thinking, okay, they've let people go before. I wonder, am I next? That's a legitimate fear to have, but it may be that it may not manifest, it may not happen. Or maybe you're worried about the collapse of a relationship. Legitimate bonds do exist between people in relationships. So it's natural that you might feel a certain amount of fear that your girlfriend or your wife or whatever it may leave you one day, especially if you have seen behavior that indicates levels of unhappiness in their lives, unhappiness with you. That's a legitimate fear. It might not manifest, but it might. So these fears that are further off, it's all the same thing. It's all just fear, and all fear is connected to time. It's just the shorter the time, the more certain the more certain that the object of fear is real. The further away that time is, the less certain. We're all afraid of death to an extent because we know that's a certainty, right? Of course, there's ways of looking at that you don't really have to be so afraid of it. All depends on whether you believe in heaven and hell and stuff like that, doesn't it? Or oblivion or whatever. But it's a certainty, yeah? I'm more afraid of the method of my dying than death itself. I wouldn't want to be suffering Alzheimer's disease where I can't think straight. My mind is the one attribute about me that I value the most. I wouldn't want to get cancer and have to suffer, because I've seen that happen. I went through that with my mum. I watched her basically being turned into a living skeleton over a period of a year, and there's always the possibility that cancer will get me. There's a certain amount of fear about that. It's part of being human. So there isn't two different types of fear, the primal fear and the egoic fear. It's all just fear, and it's all egoic, even the primal stuff, because the primal fear is to do with consciousness protecting a body from harm. So what I would say is, in partial defense of Eckhart Tolle, is that when you understand that the ego is a fiction, when you understand this in a deep way, you tend to hold life more lightly. Life is not so important, right? Because you're the universe. So one little manifestation of the universe isn't all that important. So you lose this fierce grip that you have on always staying alive at all costs. You don't go walking out in front of buses arbitrarily, because there's still a natural survival impulse here in the creature. But it's not quite as intense as it used to be. Death acceptance is actually a very important subject, because most people live with a sense of death, that it's this horrible thing that they know is going to happen to them, but it's a dreadful thought, and it's so far off in the future that they're not going to bother thinking about it now, so let's just put it out of mind. That's not the way I feel about death. I'm quite comfortable with the fact that I'm going to die, and I'm quite comfortable with talking about it too. I've integrated death very well into my understanding of life. I thoroughly recommend that. Really contemplating death and integrating it properly into your life. It's well worth. The benefits here are great. But I still have to experience consciousness. Well, can I say this without using the word I? Because I is the problem word, isn't it? I is the fake ego. Let me put it this way. Consciousness still has to experience the use of a body, the use of a mind, the protection of a body. All these things are how consciousness works. There's no getting away from it. You just hold life a little bit lighter when the understanding of consciousness is non-dualistic in nature, where you don't think there's an actual thing sitting in here that has to be protected, has to go to an afterlife somewhere. When you do away with that understanding, everything settles down, life is a bit more comfortable. So these crazy mental states of always being in anxiety all the time, they settle down. But you still have anxieties, you still have fears. It doesn't settle down completely. It can't. Because for it to be completely gone, you would have to be completely unattached to the survivability of the body through which consciousness is manifesting. Do you get that? You would have to be totally unattached, where literally walking out in front of a bus would not matter. So you're never getting rid of fear, you're never getting rid of anger and all those other unpleasant emotions. They're here to stay. They serve a purpose of keeping you alive. Eckhart Tolle just exaggerates it. So he has people chasing the dream of what he appears to manifest, but he doesn't really. To some extent, that has to be an act. Although I do think he believes his own legend. See, it's all well and good to project an image of serene, otherworldly calmness when your life doesn't really have any turbulence. He's giving nice talks to pleasant audiences. He's got plenty of money. He doesn't have to worry about that. But that's not reality for everybody, is it? You might be somebody who's got an abusive husband. You might have, you might be dealing with other family problems. You might have a daughter who recently got pregnant, who's maybe only 14 years old or something like that. You know, all these things cause emotional difficulty in life, and all those difficulties are legitimate. So let's say you're the mother of a girl of 14 who says, "Mom, I've got pregnant." What do? You go, "That's okay, dear. I'm unattached. Don't worry about it. I'm unattached. Whatever decision you make is fine because nothing actually matters. I am the universe. I am not your mother." You know, you don't want that. Come on, you don't want that kind of life. But this is where Tolle seems to be all about getting you to opt out of life. And he has said on more than one occasion, I've noticed this as a trend, you know, he's really appealing to people who have had enough of suffering, right? So that's his target audience. Have you had enough of suffering? Here I am to give you the answer. But it's not a real answer. It's to some extent a psychological trick that could lead you down the road of repressing your emotions and pretending to yourself that you don't actually feel them, because that's the ideal, right? The ideal is to not feel them. So easy to do that, you know. I can easily tell myself that I've got a strong personality here. This is not to do with non-duality. This is a different example. I've got a strong personality, a strong sense of my own self-worth. I don't have to care what other people think of me because my opinion of myself is not contingent on them liking me. I can say that, and that feels strong. It feels like good character development. It allows me to be outspoken without worrying about a backlash. And that is the ideal, but you know, that's not always true. Sometimes people say things, and sometimes it gets under my skin. And I can say to myself, that didn't affect me at all. But it's far better for me to say to myself, oh, that did affect me. That's interesting, I should look at that. Right? But when Eckhart Tolle presents you with this ideal of never feeling fear, anger, anxiety, regret, and guilt, when you feel to do that, and you will feel, you might take the position, oh, I'm unattached. I have no ego anymore. I don't feel these things. And then you end up repressing a load of this stuff, and you get into a big mess. And I've listened to somebody online who had a psychotic break as a result of listening to Eckhart Tolle. So, to some extent, I think he's an interesting person, and there's some value in studying, but to some extent, there's danger here. It's all well and good if you're in an ashram or something, or you're at a retreat, and everything's calm and peaceful, but it's no good in the real world. The real world involves conflict. And then there's this whole thing about finding stillness by getting in touch with the now, the present, and finding this stillness. And I had that once. Back when I was a Christian, talked about this before, way back when I was a Christian, I had a deep experience that was so profound that I could never really negate it. Because, you know, it would be very easy, you know, I'm so critical of Christianity. The natural position you would expect me to take is that any seemingly spiritual experience that I had as a Christian was fake or was false. But this was deep, and I don't negate it. At a period of immense suffering in my life, where I was very disconnected from worldly affairs, spending a lot of time just going out walking and kind of sitting at the edge of a field, just kind of contemplating and praying and stuff like that, I entered into some different framework of consciousness where it seemed like the reality around me took on a very different hue. And I'm using the word hue, but that's not the right word. I'm trying to be kind of poetic here because I don't have a word for this. Everything appeared as it always appeared, and yet it felt like I was in touch with the divine. And I can't describe it, but it was like I was just plugged into something that was deeply peaceful and beautiful. And it was kind of like a feeling of being utterly loved without judgment. And I interpreted it all in a Christian context because that's the kind of baggage that I had at the time. So I think I had a real experience there. And, you as a viewer, right, if you're spiritually inclined, is there something in you that says, oh, I wish I had that. I wish I could have something like that. It's not necessary. Look at me now. Where is that experience now? It's a memory. I don't have it. I can't go and sit down and connect to the now and the stillness of the now. It's gone. It's a memory trophy. It's not here. It doesn't matter whether you have it or you don't. I don't have it. And furthermore, I'm not chasing it. While it was very pleasant, the cost of it was the vitality of my life was all shrunk down because this experience only emerged at a period of intense suffering that disconnected me from my everyday life, right? That's key to understanding this. So if you want that serene bliss, there's a big sacrifice. Some people choose it. Eckhart Tolle wants you to go for that as much as possible and to stay in that state. But that's not what I want. I want a life that involves fun and ambition and striving. I want to get lost in the game of life. And the thing about it is, see these techniques that are taught for connecting to the now and finding this stillness? You can't be anywhere else but the now. Here it is. It's now. You can't separate the stillness from the everyday hustle and bustle of life. So I went through that experience. I had it. I remembered it. And I didn't look back on it as a goal that I had to keep trying to get back to. I now understand that it was kind of like a band-aid for a time in my life when I was suffering a lot. And whenever I wasn't suffering so much, my attachment to worldly affairs came back again, and I got lost in the game of life again. And that curious thing that I was plugged into settled back down, and life became ordinary again. It has to. Otherwise, your life has no vitality. So I can understand why suffering people want to get out of life, and that's exactly what it is. But to me, the sacrifice is too much. I enjoy pleasure. The pleasure always carries the potential of pain. So I accept the risk because I want my life to have vitality. I'm belaboring the point, but I think it's important. So if you suffer, maybe the suffering in your life doesn't require a spiritual solution. Maybe you just need to uncomplicate your life. And I think the lack of suffering in my life is due to the fact that I have conscientiously pursued a life that is uncomplicated. I recommend that approach to life. Not opting out of life and kind of denying all of the things that give it color. You really do have a choice, but I don't want you to think that Eckhart Tolle's choice is the only one or is the better one. And here's one thought I want to leave you with, and I think it's the most important one of all, and that is, in that other state of mind that we'll call divine, let's say, like you're plugged into a deeper aspect of reality that we might call the divine. Life is divine, even when that divinity, that sense of divinity, is veiled from us. So being out here in the world full of adventure and attachment and passion, that is not separate from reality itself. That is not separate from the divine nature of reality itself. That maybe sounds a little too religious, but I hope you kind of get the point. Reality isn't broken. So when you try to go off into these other states of consciousness, they aren't any better than the state of consciousness. They aren't qualitatively any better than the state of consciousness that is here right now. It's kind of nice for me to remember what it was like to be in that state. But now that I'm out of it, I realize that this is just as much a part of it. It's not broken. So, live your life. Take care.